Hello, my name is Austin Havish, the founder of Think Catholic, your source for Catholic thought with both depth and devotion, and I'd like to thank you for joining us. Joining me is Clare Nowak.
Hi.
And Dr. Alan Fimister.
Hello.
As today we respond to what Pope Benedict XVI called the dictatorship of relativism, and as it bears on morals, specifically then moral relativism.
And the Catholic thought on the topic from a contemporary source comes to us from Pope St. John Paul II's Veritatis Splendor, written in 1993, where he writes, "The Church's firmness in defending the universal and unchanging moral norms is not demeaning at all. Its only purpose is to serve man's true freedom, because there can be no freedom apart from or in opposition to the truth." Veritatis Splendor, number 96.
And so what is moral relativism and what's the problem with it?
I suppose moral relativism is the belief that there are no absolute standards of right and wrong, and usually, more specifically, that there are no universal, exceptionless, negative moral laws that apply regardless of circumstances. But that in fact, what you should or shouldn't do in any given set of circumstances depends on what may or may not result in your estimation from those actions. Such that if a really, really great good would be achieved by doing something that you would not otherwise think morally acceptable, it might be okay to do that thing. So if a particularly odd terrorist insists that you commit adultery with him, or he's going to blow up a football stadium full of people, then the usual prohibition on committing adultery would have to be set aside. And yes, this is a position which the Church, most famously in Veritatis Splendor, that was just quoted there, has categorically rejected since the beginning of her history. St. Paul denounces those who charge us with saying that we should do good, that we should do evil, that grace may abound, and that represents the position of the Church throughout all the ages. We will never do evil that good may come of it.
I think
as Isabella in Shakespeare's Measure for Measure, her brother is going to be executed by the corrupt Viceroy of Vienna, Angelo, unless she agrees to sleep with him. She's a poor Clare novice, and she famously says, "More than my brother is my chastity," which people often find shocking in that play, but that is a correct description of the Church's teaching, that you must never do evil that good may come of it, regardless of the circumstances.
I think it becomes...
Yeah, I think
Go ahead,
there's
Claire.
a really important thing that you find in moral relativism that you just pointed out, Doc, which is usually it doesn't go the other way. People aren't going to... They usually don't criticize good actions and say that there's no action that's entirely good. People generally avoid that because it doesn't suit our purposes. We don't need to be told that good actions are bad. We want to be told that bad actions can, in fact, be good and can be justified. And in thinking about this notion of you cannot choose evil so that good may come from it, I'm reminded of, in a previous episode, we talked about the nature of evil as a privation, as an absence. And when we think that we can choose evil in order to bring about a good, we are in a really profound way trying to put ourselves in the position of God, where we think we can create something from nothing. We can bring good about from evil, but evil is a lack of being. So we think we can bring being out of non-being, which is to put ourselves in the place of God, right? Not that God, of course, chooses evil, but when we do, we are trying to stand in God's place.
I think it's...
And of course, as Aristotle points out, but this is the doctrine of St. Thomas and St. Augustine and everybody else sane. Everything that we do for the sake of the highest good, for the sake of happiness, right? As we've discussed on this podcast a number of times in the past. So if you admit the principle that you can do something in itself evil so long as it's done for a good purpose. Given that we do everything for a good purpose, even the devil does what he does because he thinks that it somehow ends in his good. It's impossible to perform any action without intending good as the final end of that action. Therefore, to allow the principle that you can do evil that good may come of it is simply to allow evil as such. The difference between good and evil action is whether the means chosen to the highest good are good or evil. There is no other difference between good and evil. So by allowing moral relativism, one has simply just abolished the moral good completely.
And one truly is, as you mentioned, Clare, usurping the divine prerogative. And that's mentioned in Veritatis Splendor as well. So the temptation in the very beginning, we know that God commanded the man, you may eat freely of every tree in the garden except for the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And so the temptation right here from the serpent, as we know from Scripture, it'll say that when you eat of the tree, your eyes will be opened and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. Now, JP2 comes in here to say that it's not, when they eat from the tree, it's not that they will know good and evil, because they already know particular goods. They know to tend the garden. They know be fruitful and multiply. They know evils, like eating from the tree. That would be an evil. The temptation here is the ability to determine what is good, what is evil, Clare, as you mentioned, like God, because only the Creator determines that end or goal of the created, and thereby what is conducive or contrary to that goal or end. In other words, what is good or evil for the thing. So to be able to determine what is inherently good and evil for us, the created, is to attempt to usurp the divine prerogative, the divine right. And it looks like, according to JP2, that was the very first temptation, the temptation in the garden.
But in a certain sense, don't we all do that every time we sin? We say, normally it would be bad to lie to your friend, but in this case, I really need to get out of the situation, so it's good for me to lie in this situation.
And I also think the danger is because we know that it is our judgment of conscience, that we have to follow our conscience, but we have to give countenance to the fact that our conscience can be ill-informed, that our conscience can be warped. And we know with children that their knowledge of right and wrong develops over time, that it does error, and it's not this supreme law or rule. Doc, as you were saying, that there are some things that are just always wrong, universally wrong in an objective way, because we bear an objective end and an objective nature.
Yeah, I was thinking about what Claire was saying just then before about the fact that people don't normally do it the other way around. They don't normally think that a good act is rendered evil by its consequence. They think that an evil act is rendered good by its consequence. But I think one of the reasons for that is that there are universal negative precepts, but there aren't really, if you part from the golden rule itself or the great commandment, there aren't really universal positive precepts that are exceptionalist regardless of the circumstances. So you should honor your father and your mother, but if you're on your way to bring your mother a bunch of flowers on Mother's Day and you see somebody drowning, it's okay to miss the bus in order to save the person's life, right? You should fulfill the marriage debt, but if you happen to be on a crowded bus, it can wait. So this is why the question usually comes up in regard to negative precepts, because they're the ones which are, always obtained. So if you're not currently honoring your father and your mother, that doesn't mean you're definitely sinning. But if you're currently committing adultery, you're definitely sinning. Mm-hmm. So that's why they're starker, and they're the cases in which people try to come up with exceptions.
I think it's fascinating, too, the language Pope Benedict uses here, dictatorship. I'm not sure we normally associate dictatorship with relativism, because relativism is kind of this idea like hang loose, everything goes easy. But dictatorship is kind of the opposite, like the strong-fisted, iron law, just totalitarianism. But they are related. And the way that moral relativism leads to tyranny is because without that objective, unchanging moral law, then right and wrong is now floating disconnected, and it's up for grabs to be determined by the strongest or by the majority. And so it does lead to a situation where might makes right. And so the mighty or the majority, they would have the ability to determine what is morally right. And that's what JP2 will go on to warn us about. So here's his words here on this topic. He says, quote, "This is the risk of an alliance between democracy and ethical relativism. If there is no ultimate truth to guide and direct political activity, then ideas and convictions can easily be manipulated for reasons of power. And as history demonstrates, a democracy without values easily turns into open or thinly disguised totalitarianism." So the moral law can be seized and then the people manipulated. And Dr. Kreft, this is one of my favorite quotes on this topic. He says, quote, "Moral relativism has a reputation for being compassionate, caring, and humane, but it is extremely useful philosophy for tyrants." So it is this objective moral law which checks and sets boundaries to the power of the powerful. And without it, society is always going to be in danger of those laws or customs which are just destructive to humanity by being contrary to humanity.
Yeah, and I think in a very profound way, and I'm sure John Paul II is thinking of this, you can see this play out in a radical way in both communism and Nazism, right? Both of those have a philosophy that we're going to establish a paradise on earth by any means necessary. And because we have this great good for humanity in mind, so for the Nazis, it's kind of like, paradise arrived at through, genetic purity. For the communists, it's kind of paradise arrived at through the cleansing of, social classes. But both had, at least in theory, right, this great good in mind, this paradise on earth. And so the ends justify any means, right? How could people often ask, how could anybody have gone through with, Stalin's orders, with Hitler's orders? But it's because of precisely this, because moral relativism lends itself so well to might making right.
So these are our problems. This is our definition. What are the arguments against moral relativism?
I remember walking to a pub once when I was an undergraduate, and there were two slightly creepy students who were in the same year as me were having a drink together, and I asked them what they were discussing, and they were discussing the fact that they agreed that cannibalism and incest are only wrong because of social convention, and they're
Wow.
Some
not wrong.
dangerous
themselves.
people to hang out with.
Yes,
Don't let them drink too
People who would
much.
say that out loud, like that alone is what. If that's what they're saying out loud, what are they saying in private?
Well, I wasn't actually looking for them. I've forgotten why I was in the pub. I just happened to notice they were sitting at the table having this conversation. And I said, I take it that neither of you are by conviction religious. And they said yes. And I said, and you, so you are philosophically broadly materialist. And they said yes. And I said, so you think that the visible material universe is, or at least should be assumed to be, the only thing that exists? And they agreed. And I said, so in that case, there is nothing outside of nature capable of instituting an unnatural social convention. So that means that the social conventions by which these practices are considered immoral are in fact natural, because they couldn't be unnatural, because there is nothing other than nature that exists. And they were really annoyed. So I moved on, but they had no answer to that at all. But I mean, I suppose if they'd been a bit quicker, what their answer would have been is that they don't really think that natures as such exist. So presumably they would say that they think that there are just atoms and the void, and human action is completely meaningless, And so although the conventions are what they are, everything just is what it is. And so if one wants to, chomp on, somebody's arm, then that is completely okay. It's nothing is more or less okay than anything else. Now, I still think they may end up finding themselves entangled in, because they still have to ask, well, these conventions still exist. So if we want to arrest you for it, then, that's just okay as well. But I think the ultimate question is really, do things have natures? And if things have natures, which of course, if they're created out of nothing by an infinitely powerful mind, then they do. But of course, we know that they do anyway. But if things have natures, then things are objectively good or bad for them. A squishy brown apple with a little worm wriggling through it is objectively a bad apple. And a crisp, red, spherical, sweet apple is objectively a good apple because of what apples just are. And then once you've realized that, then there will be certain things which, given the nature of the object in question, the substance in question, are intrinsically incompatible with it attaining the goodness proper to its nature. And those things are just intrinsically wrong. And there's no way around it. But once you say that there are no natures, you essentially fall into a sort of epistemological black hole, because if there's no real natures to things, then there's nothing which delineates one object, even just a merely physical object in front of you, from another. Everything ends up getting sort of metaphysical trench foot. I don't know if you're familiar with trench foot. Yep. Trench foot. It's so when people were fighting in World War I and they were in soggy leather boots non-stop for week after week after week, eventually the skin of their feet began to grow into the leather of their boots. And they had to be kind of cut off agonizingly. And so this phenomenon is sort of exported to the world in general by nominalism, by the denial that things have real natures. And that means that things there's no objective limits to what anyone or any state or any other organization can do, because there's nothing which is absolutely good or bad for a nature, because there are no natures. And that's what then removes all limitations from the power of the state, which is why George Orwell said freedom is the power to say 2 plus 2 equals 4.
Yep.
Yeah. Because that's why relativism is the friend of the dictator. Because once you've taken away the absolute limits on human action, you've taken away the absolute limits on the power of the state. And as the state is much more powerful than the individual, when you end up with this anarchic, violent moral order, it will be the state that wins every battle.
I think that natural law argument really is probably one of the more foundational ones, that if anyone takes an honest look at humanity, that it's not a relative kind of thing. No matter how badly I want to be able to fly like birds or breathe underwater like fish, I cannot do that. I am a particular kind of thing. And when we use the word good, we mean normally that which is desirable. And within desires, there is a very clear distinction between those voluntary desires, which I have, which may be good or bad or right or wrong, and then those desires that my body tends towards on its own via its nature. So my nature is going to tend towards food. It's going to tend towards sleep. It's going to tend towards drink, the preservation of itself, even against my will. We know with Lent, if I see a steak on Friday, even though I'm telling myself not to desire it, my body's going to say something else, because it's programmed with certain goods which are objectively good for it. And if there are objective goods for the body, and we're body, soul, body, mind, then there's going to be objective goods for the mind as well. We know that we're naturally curious animals, that we seek to know and to learn, as the philosophers defined wonder, that once I see the effect, immediately arises in me the wonder for the cause. And so the church does us the kindness of going ahead and prohibiting those actions which are just contrary to the object of good when it comes to both our mind and our body. And that's That's suicide, that's euthanasia, that's contraception, that's drunkenness, even idolatry, and it's all founded on those objective goods arising from our nature, that we are a particular kind of thing.
What you were saying, Doc, reminded me of a Chesterton quote. Everything reminds me of Chesterton quotes. But when he says, a person cannot think if there are no things to think about. And like you said, with one of the issues with nominalism, it tries to remove all natures. But you can't actually think that way. It's one of, like, you can say that you think it, but it's very, very difficult to live that way. One of the easiest ways, I think, to dispel moral relativism would have, what you could have done at the pub is just order a lot of food and drink and put it on those guys' tabs, and they would have definitely acted like there was an objective moral standard.
Yeah, absolutely.
If somebody says they're a moral relativist, they're still going to get upset if you punch them in the face for no reason. Was it you who said that the other day?
Yeah, he's quoting.
Averroes. Averroes.
I mean,
someone denies the first principle reason.
Okay, first principle. But there's a similar need there, where you can express things like nominalism and moral relativism, but it's very, very difficult to live that way. It's very difficult to even have a conversation that actually adheres to the principles of nominalism or even moral relativism.
Yeah.
I mean, you see, there's a very funny phenomenon. The two, I don't know who the people who did this were, and I probably wouldn't agree with their worldview, but it was quite amusing in both cases. There was some angry traditional feminists, angry about trans ideology in Britain, put up billboards in various places saying, it just had a picture of the dictionary definition. It just said woman, noun, adult human female, and all hell broke loose. And they were threatened with legal action. The police insisted that it be taken down. It was absolutely crazy, and that's all the billboard said: woman, noun, adult human female. And there was some very liberal town somewhere in New England. Some people, again, I don't know who they are, and they may have had sinister intentions, I don't know, but whoever they were, they snuck through the town and put up signs everywhere saying, all it said was, Islam is right about women. And the effects were absolutely hilarious, because the people in the town were absolutely furious, and they wanted them all torn down immediately, these signs. But then when they were interviewed, they were unable to explain why they were furious, because they didn't want to say that Islam is right about women, and the idea that it is annoyed them, rightly. But they also didn't want to say that Islam is wrong about women, because that would be intolerant of them to say that Islam is wrong about women. So when they were asked, why do you want the signs taken down, none of them could explain why they wanted the signs taken down.
That's very funny.
I think, Clare, on your point here, that as lived, it's self-refuting. That nominalistic philosophy, as lived, is self-refuting. We do have the same thing here with moral relativism. So if one is being honest as a moral relativist, then he has to admit that it's just as good and right to not be morally relative, to not be a moral relativist, which of course we don't see. People who advocate for no standards and, your truth is your truth, or that's good for you, that's not good for me. Well, when you come in, you say, well, moral relativism is objectively wrong. Well, then the facade comes down, and now there are objective goods like moral relativism. But you can't do that if you're being honest as a moral relativist. You have to say, well, maybe moral relativism is good for me, but maybe it's not good for other people. So there can be no moral relativist evangelists or preachers. And as you're mentioning here, it's often the case that there are. So as lived, it can be self-refuting.
Yes, I mean, which is why, again, it's related to dictatorship and to injustice in general, because in the end, it's as you say, a self-refuting position, just like relativism in general. If you say nothing is objectively true, you're right. Like, well, is that objectively true? No. Okay, well then something is objectively true. So as you say, exactly the same thing applies to moral relativism. So in a certain sense, the person who asserts it is lying. They're not just erring, they're lying. So the question is, why are they lying? Well, the question is, it's because they want to do something bad and they want to justify it. And usually they have power and the person who will be the victim of the bad thing that they want to do doesn't have power. It's the 62-year-old wife who's been faithful to her husband for 40 odd years, who is now being abandoned by her husband for the 22-year-old model, and he suddenly discovers the merits of moral relativism as a philosophical system, or it's the tyrant who wants to paranoidly liquidate every potential enemy in the entire country, and he discovers the merits of moral relativism.
And
that's what's going on.
We can't set aside, and you mentioned it already, Doc, besides the natural law, what we can know just by reason alone, looking at ourselves, the contradiction, the self-refuting character of those who hold moral relativism. There's also the fact of God's existence, which we've talked about in a former podcast. And so if God exists, well, then goodness isn't relative because it is God. God is goodness. And that is objective. God, he has his own existence, which is not subject to whim or opinion. And Veritatis Splendor will say that. It says only God can answer the question about what is good because he is goodness itself. And he's made that answer available to us. I think about if you've got a car and you're wondering what's good for a car, well, you can do one of two things. You can look at the car, you can see how it runs. Okay, gas is good for it. Not steering in such a way or slamming into various objects. These are good for the car because of how it runs, how it works. There's one way. And then the other way would be to ask the person who built the car, how is this supposed to run? What is good for it? What is it for? And we have both of those laws, which are objective in their character. We have the natural law. Look at the way we're built, what we're for, what we tend toward objectively, and then let us see what God has revealed about us, that positive divine law. And again, neither of those are subject or subordinated to personal or societal opinion.
I think that's a great point, too. So many of the Ten Commandments, if not all of them, actually, could be known through the light of natural reason. The notion that you shouldn't kill people makes a lot of sense when you realize that human beings need to live with other human beings in order to survive, in order to make their way through the world. All of the Ten Commandments could have been arrived at through kind of natural reason. Like you said, you can study the car, see what's good for the car. But what a grace it is that God knows we're very, very, very stupid, and he spelled it out for us.
Yeah, and it's not random that the first principle of reason and the first principle of practical reason, the denial of them, with the first principle of practical reason that the good should be pursued and evil avoided, are refutable in almost exactly the same way, as you pointed out, Austin. That's because good is simply the fullness of being. So what is once you understand what an apple is, you understand what a good apple is. That's something which is an apple in the fullest sense. I often used to try and explain Aristotelian ethics to my classes at secular university that I used to teach at by simply reading them Kipling's poem "If," which ends with the line. It describes the sort of morally heroic person in very sort of edifying and inspiring terms. And then it says at the end, you will be a man, my son, if you do these things. You will be a man, meaning that you will fulfill the definition of what it means to be a man. And once you understand this distinction between that something is and what it is, and therefore the fullness of what something is achieved by it being a good instance of that thing, you're on the kind of metaphysical ladder to understanding the existence of God and the real nature of reality. And likewise, when you step away from those things into rational incoherence and moral incoherence, you're on the road to kind of madness and tyranny, through the rejection of theism and the revealed religion which theism implies. And this point that you were just making, Austin, John Paul II made it in a rather beautiful, very short document he issued in the year 2000 to commemorate the 1200th anniversary of the coronation of Charlemagne. he was complaining about the European Union had issued a Charter of Fundamental Rights, uh, really partly in order to replace the European Convention on Human Rights, which was written at a too conservative period for their tastes. And he, John Paul II, said, "I cannot conceal my disappointment that in this Charter's text there is not a single reference to God, yet in God lies the supreme source of the human person's dignity and his fundamental rights. It cannot be forgotten that it was the denial of God and his commandments which led in the last century to the tyranny of idols. A race, a class, the state, the nation, and the party were glorified instead of the true and living God. In the light of the misfortunes that overtook the 20th century, we can understand the rights of God and man stand or fall together."
It's beautiful.
So
Yep.
that's a wonderful. I
Yeah.
really like that. It one of the ways that I explain, I think, what you're talking about, Doc, to my students is to simply ask them like what the word good means in relation to various simple things. What does like a sandwich? What does it mean for a sandwich to be good? And they understand, well, it means that it tastes good and that it's good for you. It nourishes you. Because if it tastes good, but if it makes you throw up, it's not a good sandwich. What does it mean when you say a dog is good? Everybody understands a good dog doesn't just mean a pretty dog or a healthy dog. It means a dog that is obedient. That seems to be the highest, like the fulfillment of the nature of a dog. Like even if the dog is sick, even if the dog's ugly, if it's an obedient dog, you'd still call it a good dog. But when we say good man, right? When I say someone is a good man, we all understand that by good, I mean specifically virtuous. We understand that I don't mean a disloyal person, a coward. We don't, but even, we understand that good there doesn't mean he's very wealthy or he's very handsome. And I think it's interesting because by good, we all have some notion, again, from the natural law, of what attributes the good man would have. Even if in our own lives we see, oh, well, this is a good reason to be disloyal. This is a good reason to lie. This is a good reason to not be generous. But when you kind of simplify it, you can get around a lot of the nonsense that we tell ourselves to excuse our own bad behavior.
And I think we're looking at the temptation is, Chesterton will say, before you remove a fence, you need to ask, why was it put there to begin with? So this moral law, it rubs against us. It is abrasive, where our fallen nature makes it in such a way that it is difficult to do the right and the good. And so the temptation is to cure ourselves of that. The abrasion against the moral law is to remove it. But we have to ask, and Doc, you're pointing that out, why was this put here? What is the good that has put this law in place? And Frank Sheet has this great quote as we go on to our next question on why does it matter. Frank Sheet says that there's no such thing as freedom from them, from these moral laws, but only freedom within them. And freedom within them can only be attained by one who knows them. So the person who doesn't know the law of gravity, that's of no benefit to him when he falls off the top of a building. So not knowing the moral law and then trying to thwart the moral law, because it's just as real as those physical laws. No matter the opinion of the man, when he jumps off the skyscraper, he's going to now be affected by the law. We don't break the law, the law breaks us. And so why does this question matter? I'm just shocked. Harvard came out with this study on Gen Z. So Gen Z, according to Barna Research, and for the Gen Zers listening, nothing personal here. I'm a millennial. My siblings are Gen Z, so, much love there. But Barna Research came out and said that Gen Z is the most relativistic generation we've seen. And Harvard came out and said that they are the saddest generation. So here's the quote from Harvard. Quote, across every dimension of well-being that we looked at, happiness, health, meaning, character, relationships, financial stability, those who are 18 to 25 felt they were worse off across all these dimensions. It was pretty striking and pretty disturbing, end quote. And so someone could hear that and they could say, well, we had a pandemic. we've had these other maybe world tragedies that, have affected maybe these different categories. But I would say meaning, character, happiness. I think in part what's happening here is a brokenness that has resulted from breaking a moral law, which is then in turn a diminished meaning, diminished happiness, diminished character. What does it mean? Meaning, what does it mean to achieve happiness if it's relative to society or history or someone's opinion? So the question does matter, and it's bearing, I think, very deeply on Gen Z, who is struggling so greatly with moral relativism.
Yeah, one of the things I used to say to my classes when I read them Kipling's If, they usually it worked better if they'd never heard the poem before, although it often worked if they had. But I would say to them, you all realize that this poem is true. You realize that this is the description of a truly impressive human being. And you, in fact, all want to be like the person described in this poem. And you know intuitively that this is a description of what a happy person is like. And that is what you all want. You all want to be happy. The moral law is simply a description of the things you have to do if you want to become a person like this, and the things you must never do if you want to become a person like this. And so if you break the moral law, that is just because you have acted against what you desire, because everything that you desire you do for the sake of attaining happiness. So you have erred, perhaps because you were overcome by the desirability of some transitory sensible object, or by vanity, but you basically know, that's why you feel uncomfortable when you do it, that you're doing something which is creating an obstacle to your attaining to happiness, which you know was described in this poem. So people worry about freedom and losing freedom, and I would say to them, there's two ways it would seem that you could lose freedom. One is by coercion, and one is by deception. But in fact, in regard to coercion, if somebody actually just hypnotizes you or knocks you unconscious and puts your hand around a gun and fires it using your fingers, but without you having any moral autonomy at all, then you didn't do it. So in that sense, it's impossible by coercion to take your freedom away. You could try and force the person through fear, but ultimately they still have to choose or not choose to do the thing in question, like Isabella and Angelo in Measure for Measure. Whereas the only way you can really take someone's freedom away, make them do something that they don't really want to do, but really will to do it, is through deceit or error, by causing them to falsely think that something leads to happiness when in fact it doesn't. So the only real cause of enslavement, of the loss of freedom, is error, and therefore the only real cause of freedom is truth. Mm-hmm. Which is why if you don't have the truth, you will be enslaved, and if you're prevented from doing things which, if you knew the truth, you wouldn't do anyway, which is essentially what law is doing. A truly formulated law is preventing you doing something which, if you understood the truth about the good for human nature, you wouldn't want to do in the first place. That isn't, at the very least, doesn't reduce your freedom. And if you get the point, it makes you freer. Which is why, again, John Paul II said, I hope you'll forgive me for the fact that this is specific to the United States. It
Go
is
ahead.
a general sentiment. Yeah. He said, every generation of Americans needs to know that freedom consists not in doing what we like, but in having the right to do what we ought. Mm-hmm.
I think we can, maybe especially as Americans, I don't really know, but I know that Americans definitely do this. We think that freedom consists just in being able to do whatever, right? But there are so many things, even like natural physical things that we can do that would destroy our ability to even do those things. Like if you use your freedom to see to stare at the sun for hours and hours, or you use your ears to listen to, recorded sounds of explosions at full blast. You use your sense of touch to touch hot stones.
It's lost, yeah.
You can destroy your ability to sense those things. You can, or at least severely limit them. You can ruin your eyes by misuse of sight. You can ruin your ears by misuse of hearing. But we act like somehow our spiritual dimension would be different, right? We act like we know that we have there are certain physical things that we oughtn't do, or we won't be able to do even those things. But we act like our soul should somehow be different than that.
And speaking to your point there, Doc, about the truth will set you, that was actually today's readings, perhaps, and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. I think that was either today or yesterday's readings, that the other component to freedom. So you mentioned truth and error, but then also virtue and vice, that we've all had this experience where I've known what is right to do. Hopefully you guys haven't had this experience, but I definitely have, where I know what is right to do, but then my passions or my emotions, just the disorder in the heart, which is vice, rises up against reason, and I can convince myself otherwise. So that freedom, Doc, that you're talking about, so the freedom to know, and then the virtue to carry out, to pursue that which I know, to not be deceived by my concupiscible, irascible passions. And as you're saying, that's the purpose of the law. As a parent, Doc, surely you're right now trying to teach right and wrong, but then also to engrave it into their hearts through repetitive action, through virtue.
Absolutely. Leo the 13th, he has an interesting definition. It's absolutely wonderful encyclical, actually, that he wrote called Libertas. I mean, all Leo the 13th encyclicals are wonderful, but
Agreed.
But it's about the nature of freedom. It's an absolutely wonderful encyclical, and he gives a strange definition, a very insightful one of law. He calls law a fixed rule of teaching what is to be done and what is to be left undone, which is a surprising definition of law. But it's because he sees ultimately that what law is a truth about the good for man, or the good for angel, or the good for cabbage, or whatever the substance happens to be, and which liberates and which protects. It's surprising because he's such a great devotee of St. Thomas Aquinas, and he does elsewhere quote and use St. Thomas's definition of law, which would take an entire podcast to describe in its sublimity. But I thought that that particular definition is striking. It helps to, which I'm sure was his purpose, helps to sort of surprise the reader into realizing what is really going on there.
And so there's always more to say, but moral relativism, which asserts that right and wrong are relative to the person or to one's society or time in history, it is false. On the grounds it is commonly used, it is logically incoherent. For even moral relativism cannot be objectively good, but according to its own precepts, only relatively good, along with moral relativism being contrary to human nature, divine law, and the overall purposefulness, the teleology found in nature. This is Think Catholic. My name is Austin Habish, along with Clare Nowak and Dr. Alan Fimister. And thanks again for joining us.